Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Monday, October 2nd, 2023. Colonel Douglas Macgregor joined us again. Colonel, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to talk to you about a piece that you are publishing later this week entitled Washington on the Knife Edge. And of course, I encourage everyone watching us now to get a copy of that, log on to it and read it, Washington on the Knife Edge. But before we get to the salient points in your piece, who is behind the long and loud portrayal of the Russian military as weak, demoralized, and dysfunctional?
Well, my suspicion is that this is once again sort of cooked up by a combination of MI6 and the Central Intelligence Agency. Is part of the larger narrative, and that was wholeheartedly embraced, obviously, by the senior military leadership of the United States and Great Britain in particular. I think you could probably throw Australia into that mix, to a lesser extent, other European powers who want to maintain this sort of disparaging picture of Russia in general, but its military in particular. I think there's been an attempt to try and persuade Americans that what we are doing in Ukraine is not dangerous, when in fact it is. It's very dangerous. But if you can persuade Americans and Europeans, as many as possible, that Russia is really weak and incapable, which was the argument, then Americans will presumably have less objection to the introduction of their military advisors, equipment, and so forth into the conflict.
So did American intel and their Western partners fully and adequately and accurately assess Russian strength and morale and just lie about it? Or do they really and truly believe that the Russian military is dysfunctional, and as bad as Ukraine is, it can stop them or even push them back? Stated differently, wasn't there a moral obligation on the part of the American Defense Department before getting us involved in this to make a serious, mature, and accurate assessment of Russia's strengths?
I think you're absolutely right. They had a moral and professional obligation both to tell people the truth. But the problem that we have in the English-speaking world and in the United States in particular, sort of bad habit of disparaging foreign military forces and their leaders that we don't really know very well. If you read the assessments of the Germans before it landed at Normandy, they were ridiculous. They painted the picture of a failed army that couldn't present real resistance, that was incapable of initiative and rigid and inflexible. And of course, the opposite was the case. It was very much the opposite. We took a similar view of the Japanese. So did the British. If you go back and look at the fall of Singapore, and how that came about, and how a British army of 120,000 surrendered to fewer than 60,000 Japanese troops, you have to understand the sort of disdain, even contempt, that we in the United States and Great Britain had for the Japanese, not only the Germans. So this is not new. And historically, even Europeans who were closer to Russia had a bad habit of misjudging the Russians. Frederick the Great did it. And on one occasion, it almost cost him the total destruction of his army. From that point forward, the Prussians and the Germans in general took a different position. But historically, it's always been a problem, Judge. And remember, there's something else here. You have too many people in the federal bureaucracy and in the military who are desperate to get ahead. They will willingly misinform their superiors. Why do I say misinformed? By providing them what they want to hear.
Right.
There's no real room for somebody. It's everybody's on the bus to Abilene. For your viewers, if you go look at the Abilene Paradox, it's this groupthink that says no one wants to stand out. Everyone wants to be on board. Everyone wants to be on the team. So everybody gets on the bus to Abilene that takes hours. It goes to a dinner that nobody really wants in Abilene because the one or two people that spoke out against it were immediately shunned and suppressed by the few that wanted to go. This is an old story. It's a hugely destructive influence. It's very strong in the U.S. military and in our federal bureaucracy, and I suspect in the intelligence community.
Here's an example of a man who apparently mastered it because he retired with 4 stars. And at the time of his retirement, he was the commander-in-chief of military forces in all of Europe, General Ben Hodges, making a statement about Russia, which, well, it's relatively brief. It's some 60 minutes over the weekend, and you'll hear it, see it, and I'm anxious to hear, you will like it. I'm anxious to hear your comment on it.
If you think about it, Russia has been for decades and still is an existential threat for Europe and the United States. I mean, just listen to what their leaders say. Look at the thousands of nuclear weapons. They clearly will keep going if they're not stopped.
It sounds like you're saying stopping Vladimir Putin in Ukraine directly benefits every American.
Absolutely. This war is about so much more than just Ukraine.
Colonel.
Well, the Russians at the outset of this war had about 190,000 troops assembled for intervention in Ukraine. Of that number, they initially only sent 90,000 in. And as we've discussed before, I think Putin was under the misapprehension that this would signal his resolve and Russia's resistance to the transformation of Ukraine into a platform for the projection of hostile military power from the United States and NATO toward Russia. Well, he was wrong. And there was no intent to negotiate or compromise, and the rest is history. So we go from a situation where the Russian military was clearly too small for the mission assigned to it, to a Russian military that has grown dramatically and increased in lethality and capability over the last year plus. So where was the evidence for this dire intent to conquer Eastern Europe before this? And by the way, the Russians have sat in their defensive positions around the territory that they gained for months.
Right.
They've had the initiative now for at least 6 months. There's nothing stopping them from attacking. So why haven't they attacked? Well, the answer, of course, from the people in the administration and elsewhere is, well, the Russians are incompetent. They can't do it. Well, that's ridiculous. They've been swatting the Ukrainians like flies. The Ukrainians are being annihilated. Every time they stick their heads up, they're killed. The Russians can clearly attack. Putin doesn't really want to advance any further west than he absolutely has to. The bad news for us is that right now the Russians have completed between 200 and 300 extra kilometers of rail lines into eastern Ukraine. That's for logistics. That indicates the real preparation potentially for a massive offensive towards the West. And I think once again, Putin is wrong. He thinks he's going to get a negotiated settlement, or he assumes we'll go bankrupt and simply leave. You know, that would be nice, I suppose, in some respects for him. But the bottom line is, I don't think it's going to be that easy.
But General Hodges' statement, he can't possibly believe this. It sounds like he's selling snake oil. It sounds like he's just part of the CIA and MI6, as you talked about this a few minutes ago, propaganda to a very pliant media because he wants to enrich his friends in the military-industrial complex. I mean, I am attributing ignoble motivation to him. I don't know the man. I don't know his intellect. I've been profoundly unimpressed by everything I've heard him say, but to say outright, Russia, not the Russian military, not Vladimir Putin, not Russian culture, Russia is an existential threat to the United States. Just absurd and baseless, Colonel.
Well, remember that the requirements for the people who are admitted to the senior ranks of the intelligence organizations are much higher than what we require of general officers. When it comes to general officers, it's a hit or miss proposition. You'll find a few who are actually smart, who read a great deal. You know, General MacArthur used to set aside 2 hours every night all through the Second World War, where he would read material that he thought was pertinent and relevant. And he also cleaned out his proverbial inbox himself every day, read all the material, wrote all of the reports. We don't have people doing that now because they don't have the ability to do it.
How did President Zelensky go from hero to zero, your phrase, not original, but nicely put,
Right.
in 19 months, Colonel?
Well, let's go back to the outrageous predictions and sort of celebratory nonsense that went on in the Western media for months and months and months. I mean, almost immediately, I remember in February or early March, I was attacked for suggesting that the man was an empty facade, and if anything, an actor and not much more, by I think it was Jennifer Griffin and her sidekick on Fox, former congressman whose name escapes me. And they were saying, oh, no, this man is an heroic figure that we should all worship, and compared him to Churchill and God knows what else. That's all nonsense. It always was nonsense. We're not completely sure who's really running the show in Ukraine any more than we are here in Washington. But the behavior of this man over the last year and a half is just atrocious. He's sent tens of thousands of his countrymen to their deaths, and knowing full well from the very beginning that it couldn't be done. Victory was an impossibility, and insisting that they hurl themselves into these impregnable Russian defenses. He still wants them to do it again and again and again. And there's no political rationale that justifies this. So I think the man is being exposed. And I liked Elon Musk's comment that every few minutes or so, he opens his mouth and wants another $1 billion from the United States. And of course, we have no idea where all of that money is going any more than we can trace the equipment. The whole thing is a fiasco and a scandal.
What about General Zelensky, who's the commander, and whom you have said and your colleagues have said is respected internationally as a serious military leader? Is the Ukraine military poorly led by General Zelensky? Is he big-footed by this comedian turned politician turned president?
Well, remember that everybody in the military side and the officer corps, one way or another, is part of the grift. You have battalion commanders who are pocketing the salaries of soldiers that were under their command, who are now killed in action, preventing their widows from receiving any compensation from the Ukrainian government. Everyone is involved in grabbing whatever he or she can get for themselves. That's the problem in Ukraine. The place is more corrupt than Mexico, and that's saying something if you've been to Mexico. So I think you have to keep this in mind. Secondly, Zelensky, I have no doubt that privately he is told the truth, and he's been ignored and told to shut up and get back to work. And it may well be that he too has been told to do so at gunpoint. I have no idea. So I just think that at this stage, it doesn't really matter, because at the levels that count, once you get down inside the Ukrainian army, there are so many foreign elements directing operations from various places and pushing the Ukrainians into action. There's so much distrust between the soldiers who are being asked to fight and the officers who are commanding them that they whittle down squads to 3 or 4 men to prevent larger formations from forming that might actually rebel. It's a terrible condition, and the people are simply being fed systematically into the so-called meat grinder. Now, we know that over the last several months, there have been a lot of surrenders. There's no question about it. There's plenty of video footage to show that. And I would expect that to continue, perhaps even worsen in time. But it's tragic that we continue to underwrite all of it. We own the place. The place is the 51st state. This was Senator Rand Paul's argument. He's spot on. We're paying the salaries of the government, of the bureaucracy, of the military. What are we not funding over there? It's ridiculous.
Well, before the so-called deal, which extended Mrs. Pelosi's spending levels for another 45 days that Congress concocted over the weekend, the president said publicly, don't worry, the money will still keep flowing to President Zelensky, even if the government shuts down. Do you know if the United States and NATO engaged in an evaluation of Ukrainian military, its command structure, its support structure, before we started to send $100 billion over there?
I know that in NATO, everyone does whatever we tell them to do, Judge. Let's be frank. We dominate NATO. NATO is an extension of our military power, our influence on the continent. The Europeans have made themselves satellite states of the greater U.S. empire and military hegemony. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you've got large numbers of senior officers, particularly from Great Britain, to some extent from Germany and France, who are all prepared to stand up and defend to the bitter end whatever they're told to do by the United States. They have been completely assimilated into the so-called Borg, if you will. In other words, they adopt what we say, they adopt what we think, they adopt the tactics we suggest. There are some dissenting voices, but they're suppressed. There are people over there that know better. You know, you've had General Kuyat, a German, retired four-star, who's been very prominent in Germany, speaking out against the stupidity, saying, you know, Russia's a great power, whatever made you think otherwise. But, you know, he's the Lone Ranger. The vast majority are sort of zombies who simply march in the direction that we send them. So it didn't matter if you did in NATO a serious evaluation. You were going to be told, this is what you're doing, get on with it, or you're out of a job.
You mentioned earlier, whoever's in charge of the American government, we're going to play a clip which is embarrassing for the president. It's a presser that he had earlier today, and the question asks, can you trust Speaker McCarthy? The conversation that precedes what we're about to tell you was, okay, McCarthy and the Republicans made a deal with the Democrats, no more aid to Ukraine, but we'll fund the government at the Pelosi levels. I have been harshly critical of this deal, but it's a done deal. The president signed it. So then the question is, how can you trust Speaker McCarthy to come through with aid to Ukraine when he sold it out in order to get this legislation that you just signed into office? So at that point, we enter the presser. It is difficult to watch the President of the United States of America at the end of his attempts to answer these simple questions.
Are you going to be able to trust Speaker McCarthy when the next deal comes around?
We just made one about Ukraine, so we'll find out.
But are you worried that he is going to be forced by fellow Republicans to back away from any deal he cuts with you?
I hope this experience for the Speaker has been one of a personal revelation. I'm not being facetious. Anyway.
So somebody's running the show. Somebody's deciding to spend $100 billion. Somebody decided to ask McCarthy for another $6 billion for a month. Somebody wants the Congress for another $28 billion. I don't know if the mentality of the man we just watched, and I say this with pity, not with joy, is capable of making those determinations. Who are these people that are calling the shots for American foreign policy? Mrs. Newland, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, but apparently not the man we just watched, Colonel.
You know, Judge, if you think about it carefully, there's a wonderful book called Anatomy of Revolution. And when you read this by Crane Britton, this comes across a lot like Louis XVI in 1788, 1789, 90. Louis XVI was not a bad human being per se, but he was rather feckless. He was overwhelmed, responded in much the same way. And the people that were advising him were also people that were neither officially appointed in most cases, nor were they obviously elected to anything. And the rest is history. And I kind of think the more I see of this administration and the more I hear about the things that they're trying to do, sometimes I think we're France before the revolution. There's no direction. There's no one at the helm. We are sort of at the mercy of the prevailing winds. And those prevailing winds for the moment come from the wealthy people that influence and shape policy through their respective minions, people like Newland and Blinken and Sullivan and others.
How did the uniparty and the neocons make this kind of a useless, fruitless, expensive, bloody war acceptable to Americans? Is it because no American boys are coming home in body bags, unlike in Vietnam?
Well, that's a critical component of it, yes. First of all, keep in mind, most Americans on any given day, and I try to tell my friends in Europe and Northeast Asia this all the time, and they look at me a little strangely. But most Americans on any given day don't care what happens beyond our borders, Judge. And you know, why should they? If you live in Kansas City, in Portland, Oregon, somewhere in Iowa, somewhere in Kansas or Alabama, your life has very little to do with what happens beyond your borders. And so we've been in the habit for a very, very long time of consigning responsibility for the conduct of our foreign and defense policy to people in Washington. And we've tended to ask very few questions. What do we got for an ideology leading us right now? This ideology is an ideology of fear. It promotes enemies overseas that we must defend ourselves against. It promotes the notion that free speech and free thinking are dangerous to the American public, that therefore that must be suppressed. This is a very strange environment, and I think Americans are beginning to realize they've lost control of the government. But this happened a long time ago. People are used to making these decisions in a vacuum. We've decided it's in the interest of the United States that we should put ourselves in a position where we could actually be dragged into a war against Russia. And we all know it's not just Russia. If we end up at war with Russia, we'll be at war with China. Certainly Iran will come on board. India is not going to help you. The Japanese are going to walk away from you as quickly as they can. So what does that leave you with? A bunch of Europeans who are not prepared to fight any more than we are. So this is not a new problem, but it is an old one. And the only way to solve this is to get into that government and root out these people and replace them and find a new way forward. Perhaps that will happen over the next 12 months. I just hope it happens soon enough, because right now we're on the knife's edge. That's the point. People don't understand that this war in Ukraine is over. The prominent Russian politician in the Duma, in the parliament, who spoke the other day and said the Ukrainians have one of two choices. They can either meet our demands or they can go out of existence. He wasn't kidding.
Right.
Moscow is not going to sit there and let us move anything we want back into Western Ukraine. They're not going to tolerate someone in the government there who's fundamentally hostile to Russia, incurably hateful. They will insist on someone in that government that watches out for Russian national security interests. So what are we going to do? If this were put into a referendum and people were allowed to discuss it for 30 days, I think Americans would come out overwhelmingly against doing anything in Ukraine. But we won't do that. And no one in Washington wants that, because they're profiting from this. And the people in Washington think that the United States is still living in 1992, that our armed forces are what they were 30 years ago, that there are no problems. There's nothing that serious happening here. Therefore, they have the freedom of maneuver to do whatever they want. That's ridiculous. It's wrong. It's dangerous. That's where we are.
Colonel, you're eloquent and brilliant as always. Thank you very, very much for joining us. The column, for those of you that want to read it, which I guess will be out in a day or so, is called Washington on the Knife Edge.
In the American Conservative.
The American Conservative, by our dear friend, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel, always a pleasure. We'll see you again soon, sir. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Wow. More as we get it, my dear friends. It's only Monday, and that is a lot to think about already. We're up to 203,000 subscriptions. Our goal is 250,000 by Christmas time. I'm still trying to comprehend everything that he said. It was so brilliant and so profound, but you can play it over and watch it as many times as you like. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.